when I read this passage, I thought about Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration coming down with Peter, James, and John. And when they get to the bottom of the hill, the mountain there, they come across a big crowd. And in the middle of the crowd is a desperate father who had brought his son to the disciples because he was demonized. And he asked them to cast the demon out of his son, and they couldn't do it. So they're arguing amongst themselves. And Jesus comes down and says, "What are you arguing about?" And the man explains. And Jesus says, basically, "Well, how long has this been happening?" And the desperate father says, "Virtually his whole life. And I asked your disciples to cast out the demon, and they could not do it." And the desperate father says, "So if you can do something, if you can save him, please do." And Jesus was like, "If I can? All things are possible if you would only believe." And the man answered, the desperate father answered, "What? I do believe. Help my unbelief." Meaning, help me overcome my doubts. I believe, I want to believe more. Help me overcome my doubts. It's virtually the same attitude that Moses has in Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4, we're going to look at verses 1 through 9. Now, you know the context. Moses is standing before the burning bush, and he's having a conversation with God. He's received a commission to go to Egypt and rally the elders of the people of God to confront Pharaoh, to have Pharaoh let his people go. And Moses has thus far been pretty compliant, although he's had some questions. But you can feel a little bit of protest rising in his heart, and it accelerates a little bit in this passage. Verse 1. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice." And more accurately, what if they don't believe me or listen to my voice? "For they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is that in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and catch it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Again, the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. "If they will not believe you," God said, "or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground." We'll pause there for today and study the rest next week. Our main idea for today is this: what God says we should believe. Thankfully, however, He accommodates our doubts. What God says we should believe. But thankfully, however, He accommodates our doubts. We're going to explore that one main idea today. No really subpoints today. A little bit of an abbreviated message to accommodate our Lord's Supper service today. So we're just going to drive home that main idea, which is probably what I should be doing every week anyway. But let's have a time of prayer before we do that. Heavenly Father, we recognize that we struggle like that desperate father, like Moses, like doubting Thomas sometimes, to believe your word, to take you for your word. We know that's foolish, but we are sinful humans. We confess it, we acknowledge that your word is true, and we do believe it. help us to overcome our doubts and our fears. Speak to us by your word, by this word today, the example of Moses. Teach us about yourself and how we should worship and adore you more, and how we should be your people to a lost and dying world. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, verse 1. You need to know that my ESV, my beloved ESV, the NIV, and even the KJV, the King James, kind of botched this first sentence. There should be an if at the beginning of Moses' objections. The better translation work was done by the New American Standard Version, or Bible, to Dr. Morgan's delight, but also to the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the New Living Translation, to Dr. Morgan's delight. So that doesn't really solve the translation debate, but they all got it right. And the rest kind of messed it up there. My understanding is that this is not a flat-out contradiction that Moses is just arguing with God. He didn't say, they won't believe me, but he did have doubts. It should have been enough to take God at his word. What God says, we should believe. But Moses is not arguing with God. He just has doubts. But, of course, the Lord is not surprised by this. He knows Moses' heart, and he has prepared a threefold display to help overcome Moses' doubts and indeed overcome Israel's doubts, to convince them that he indeed had revealed himself to Moses at Sinai. And you think about it. Out of the blue, after silence of over 400 years, a fellow comes out of the wilderness to you and says, hey, your God has spoken to me. Let's go confront Pharaoh. It would take a little bit of faith. And I thought about John 14, verses 10 and 11, where Jesus talks to his disciples and he says, do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. He's talking to the disciples that have been with him virtually 3 years in ministry, seen all the miracles he's done, and heard all of the lessons and the sermons that he's preached. And he says, so you're still having trouble believing my words? Well, then at least believe in me because of the miracles I do. Again, what God says, we should believe. Thankfully, however, he accommodates our doubts. And so God gives Moses 3 miraculous signs to satisfy his struggling faith. And all 3 signs involve the Lord changing something into something else. That is, taking the physical, natural form of an object and transforming it into something else. And the first sign is turning Moses' shepherd's staff into a snake. In verse 2, he gives Moses the opportunity to examine his staff. He says, what do you have in your hand? And of course Moses says the staff. It's his shepherd's staff. It's what he uses to beat off wolves and any other, it's a shepherd's staff. So he knows that it's a staff. There's no David Copperfield illusion here. There's no smoke and mirrors. It is a wooden staff. Verse 3, the Lord commands Moses to throw the staff on the ground. And when he did, the staff turned into a snake. And Moses ran from it like a little girl. Actually, I've known more men to run away from snakes than little girls, but either way, it really is a snake. Moses has been a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years. He knows what a snake is. And his staff had turned into a snake. So he ran away, not all the way away, but he obviously steps back a little bit alarmed, and then the Lord commanded him to grab the snake by its tail. My understanding is that's typically not the safest place to grab a snake, by the way. They can whip around and get you. It's safer to grab them behind the head of the neck. I remember one time when I grew up in a little Christian church out in the country, a little basement church, and we didn't have air conditioning, imagine that. windows all open. And one Sunday morning, as pastor was preaching, we had just one aisle of pews, and down the center of the aisle came a little black snake. Not actually a little black snake, about a 6-foot black snake. And you can see Moses parting the waters. That just from the back to the forward, everybody just kind of scooted on down. And my brother got up, went to the pew, grabbed it behind the neck of it, by the neck, and took it outside to the woods, and we went on with our service. Make your own spiritual applications there. But it's safer to grab them, typically behind the head or the neck. But Moses does as he's commanded, and he grabs it by the tail. And lo and behold, the snake became a staff again. And so the first miracle, the first sign, is done. 2 quick need to knows about this sign. You need to know first that we should not allegorize this miracle. A typical interpretation in the past has been to say that that is saying that Moses had the serpent, Satan, by the tail when he went to Egypt. Well, that'll preach, but it's not really what the point is. The point is overcoming Moses and Israel's doubts. It's not identifying the serpent and what that represents. Secondly, you need to know that this miracle wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't supposed to be a one-time thing. This is going to be something that Moses can do virtually at will to prove to those that he is God's man for the mission. And we'll see that later on. But let's look at verse 5. Notice that purpose clause. The unspoken question is, why am I doing this? Why am I showing this to you? Why am I making you do these miracles? The answer is, so that they may believe that the Lord has appeared to you. Meaning Israel. This is primarily for Israel's belief. But obviously Moses has a few unbelief issues himself. This is God accommodating our human doubts. Specifically Israel's doubts. And these miracles are performed that they may believe. 5 times in this passage you see that word believe. And it's almost as if these miracles have a voice. They have an argument. These miracles speak. In verse 6 and 7, the Lord gives Moses a second sign. And I read it. He turns Moses' clean, healthy hand into a white, leprous, diseased hand. And it must have been dramatic enough for him to realize this wasn't a natural thing, a natural disease. And it's one thing to see something happen to something else, a staff turn into a snake and then back to a staff again. Or even to have something occur to someone else. It's quite another thing to have it happen to you. When you have a personal experience like that, it really resonates in your soul. And that's what happened to Moses. His hand turned into a diseased, leprous, cancerous, white, sick hand. And the idea of this miracle is, okay, you've been living in Midian and before that Egypt. What God have you encountered in this region that can do this? Do you know of any God like that? I am the Lord who can both inflict harm and save from harm. In fact, Deuteronomy 32:39 says just that. There's no God besides me. The Lord says, I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. That's the idea here, that God can do whatever he wants to inflict harm on the wicked or to save the righteous. Verse 8, we come to verse 8. Like I mentioned, the word believe is used 5 times in these few verses. And in verse 8, this is the 3rd and 4th time that word is used. And there's an if in these verses. And I don't think it's really an if of ignorance. Can we honestly say that God is saying, if this doesn't happen? No, I think it's just a usage of it's an if of certainty. He's using human language. We could paraphrase it like this. Since they're going to have doubts about your authenticity, I've given these signs to you, to perform in front of them, so that they will believe. In fact, by these signs, they will believe. I'm going to make sure they believe. If not by the first miracle, then by the second miracle. If not by the second miracle, then at least by the third miracle in verse 9. And that third miracle is for the really stubborn doubters. A sign eventually that Moses would do in front of the Egyptians themselves. And obviously, this isn't a sign that Moses can do at Mount Sinai. It's not one that occurs right in front of him. He was supposed to, when he goes before the elders, take water from the Nile River and pour it out on the ground, where it would turn into blood. Now, I think where the serpent of the first miracle should not be interpreted to symbolize Satan or even Pharaoh, because of Pharaoh's headdress that may or may not look like a cobra's head. So there's not necessarily symbolism here. I think this miracle is clearly symbolic. Because for Egypt, the Nile River was a god. It was the giver of life. Water and food were dependent upon the seasonal flooding of the Nile River. In fact, there wasn't just one god of the Nile, there were many. There's at least three. Hapi was, ironically, or not ironically, but interestingly, a hermaphroditic god that had both male and female body parts. And it supposedly fertilized the land and nourished the land. Then there was Osiris, which was Hapi's father. And then Subat was the crocodile god. And all of these gods were responsible, supposedly, for the seasonal flooding of the Nile River that caused fertilization of the river valley, which provided grain and water and food. All of life depended upon the Nile. So by turning the Nile River water into blood, what is God saying? God was displaying his authority over that life-sustaining hydration of the Nile River valley, but also more authority and power over those representative gods. Blood would contaminate the drinking supply. You can't drink blood. Fish can't breathe blood. You can't water your crops and your livestock with blood. And in the thinking of the ancient Middle East, these kind of natural or supernatural phenomena had spiritual realities. The gods determined what took place. At least that's how it was interpreted. Therefore, turning the Nile River water into blood would communicate to both Israel and Egypt that Yahweh, the Lord, was stronger than any and all other Egyptian gods combined. So he gives them three signs that the Lord was to give to Moses to share with Israel to prove that he was prophetically called to lead them out of Egypt and into the promised land, and that all their gods were null and void compared to the one true and living God. Unfortunately, Moses isn't done doubting, or at least rejecting or asking the Lord to send somebody else. We're going to see that next week. But that's for another lesson. You fast forward, almost finished. We fast forward to chapter 4, verses 29 through 31. We look at those verses. And Moses and Aaron, his brother, who he recruits, do these exact signs before Israel. And the word says what the people saw the signs and they believed, just like God said they would. And they worshiped God. They worshiped. They believed, just like the Lord said. So I was thinking of another doubter, and I mentioned him. In fact, that was his nickname, Doubting Thomas. Traditionally, the history of the church, the Apostle Thomas. And you know the story. On Resurrection Sunday evening, the Lord appeared before the disciples to prove to them that he had bodily raised from the dead. But Thomas wasn't there, was he? He didn't see it. He didn't meet the resurrected Christ. And so when the other disciples, the other 10 disciples, tell him about it, what does he say? He says, I won't believe until I see the wounds in his hands and his side and his feet. Unless I can put my fingers there, I won't believe. Well, the following Sunday, the Lord appeared again to the disciples. And this time, Thomas was there. And what did Jesus do? Did he scold him? Well, mildly. It was a mild rebuke. But did he ridicule him? Did he fire him as an apostle? Did he send him straight to hell? No. What did Jesus do? He said, "Come here, Tom. Put your hands here. Touch me and see. Stop doubting and believe." What God says, we should believe. Thankfully, however, he accommodates our doubts. I will put a little asterisk here, a disclaimer. God doesn't tolerate perpetual doubting, obviously. He won't accommodate continued unbelief. The idea is if you have doubts, you need to work it out. You need to confess it to him. Admit to God that you're struggling with this issue or your belief or your faith. Ask him to reveal himself to you. I think that's a prayer the Lord will always answer. If your heart is genuine, he will accommodate your struggles and your doubts. After all, he already knows our hearts more than we do ourselves. So there's no point in hiding. I found in my life, it's better to just come straight out to God and say, "Lord, I'm struggling with this. I'm not believing, and I need your help." Make your prayer that of the desperate father. I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Be honest before the Lord. Because again, I am Moses. You are Moses. We are Israel. We struggle with the same things. What God says, we should believe. Thankfully, however, he accommodates our doubts. I'm going to pause and have a word of prayer.